Day 11 of the 2024 FIDE Candidates saw Jan Nepomniachtchi regain the lead once again with 7 out of 11 points after a crucial win against Vidit Gujrathi with the Black Pieces. It was an absolutely crazy day of action in Toronto, so let's get right into it. Going into the day's results, Hikaru Nakamura managed to defeat Praggnanandhaa with black to get closer to the leaders. Meanwhile, GCash Caruana ended in a draw, and Fuja made quick work of Alekseev. However, Nepo managed to win a very long endgame against Vidit, one where the advantage went back and forth. And after today's action, we have Nepo leading the tournament with 7 out of 11, GCash and Naka a half point behind on 6.5, and Caruana a full point behind on 6 points with 3 rounds left to play. In the women's candidates, Tanjong took the sole lead once again, defeating Katerina Logno as her main rival, Lei Tingjae, only managed to escape with a draw against Anna Muzychuk. So Tan now leads the event with 7.5 points, with Lei on 7 and also 3 rounds left to play. Jumping into today's games, we'll start with the game between Praggnanandhaa and Hikaru. And in this one, Naka plays the unusual move 3c5 in a classic Queen's Gambit position. This one leads to sharp complications. Pragg already started spending time here, as he likely wasn't expecting this, but does go for one of the critical lines where we get an early endgame here after knight c3, knight d4, queen takes d4, knight d4, black plays a6, g3, and white should be a little bit better here with the bishop coming to g2, but Naka was very well prepared, blitzing out his moves here: e5, knight c6, bishop g2, and now a5. And I'm not clear exactly where white could fight for an advantage here. Bishop e3 is one move given by the engine, knight a4 is another move. Pragg goes for knight to b5, which probably isn't critical. It does threaten the fork, but after bishop to b4 check and king to e7, black avoids the knight c7 threat and actually starts to stand quite comfortably. Nevertheless, the position was definitely equal for some time, but after bishop e6, rook a6 here, rook to d8, knight e3, I think at around this point, Naka starts to get a bit of an advantage. He gets his rook to a5, so this move knight e3 from Pragg, maybe not ideal, because now black gets rook a5, and here Pragg decides to take on c6. But either way, black's bishop is coming to b3, and the issue is that it's going to be very hard for white to challenge for the d-file. That's what we see in the game after the trade. Knight c3, bishop comes to b3, and the engine doesn't think white's position is that bad here, evaluating it as close to equal, but from a human point of view, it does feel difficult to play, as black is always ready to invade with rook to d2, and the bishop on b3 is very annoying. Naka continues here with g6, knight to d5, gets f5 in, and here the game gets very sharp as Pragg decides to break things open with g4. But now black takes, knight takes f4, and king to e3 was Pragg's intention, but ends up being a blunder. King to e1 was the only move according to the engines here, and the position remains quite complicated. The e4 pawn is hanging, but objectively black should still be clearly better here. Instead in the game we saw king to e3, but now knight to d5 check. If white takes this one, then bishop takes d5, and the b2 pawn is hanging, and this is just a very, very difficult endgame for white. Instead, Pragg took on e4 with the king, but now knight c3, pawn takes, and c5, very, very nice move, including black's rook into the action, and it turns out that white's king here ends up in a lot of danger. In fact, white is likely just already lost. Rook f4 was the game, but now bishop d5 check, and h5 from Naka, very precise move. If knight to f2, then rook to e6, lands white in a lot of trouble. King to d2, g5 is a nice point, and anywhere the rook moves, there's going to be a discovered check to pick up the rook. So in view of some of these lines, Pragg goes c4, bishop a8, and now knight to h6. But after rook check and rook f6, this knight simply ends up trapped on the side of the board, and eventually Pragg does have to give back the knight. Rook f1 check, king to g7, he finds knight f5, which is probably the best try. Does get a couple pawns for the knight, but this is not enough to compensate for the bishop, and Naka's technique here was quite good enough to convert the game, getting the king in, taking on c4. And after e4 here, rook c6, there's just a couple more moves as Naka makes sure that white's e-pawn doesn't go forward. He starts pushing his c-pawn, and now check, rook d3. This basically ended the game. Rook to b3 check, black trades on g3, And here Prague resigned, as after hg c3, the king can't get back to stop the pawn in time. Black is just making a new queen and winning the game. Moving to the game between GCash and Caruana, this one started off as a queen's gambit declined, and early on we get a pretty imbalanced position here, with Caruana going for this early advance with g5 and knight h5, picking up the two bishops, but at the cost of black structure on the king side. Nevertheless, this position is strategically very, very rich. Objectively, white is probably a little bit better here, but black definitely has their share of chances with the two bishops and eventual play on the king side with ideas like h5 and h4. This game continues quite thematically, with GCash pushing on the queen side, knight a4, knight to c5, Fabi trades, bc, and now Fabi goes f5. Definitely an important move. Otherwise, white would be able to plant the bishop on f5, and black would definitely be under some serious pressure. However, after f5, the game gets rather sharp. GCash goes for queen to c3, setting up for a future knight to e5. If white doesn't manage to get the knight to the square, white could be in some serious danger here, as black is eventually going to push f4 and start opening things up on the king side. That said, white definitely was totally fine here. In fact, the engines do even prefer white's position, though GCash moves back and forth a little bit, but eventually does get this knight to e5. Black is forced to take, as otherwise f4 will support the knight. And now after takes, game continues with h5, GCash goes f4, and now queen to d8 from Caruana. In this position, again, the engines like white here, but it's very, very complicated, as black wants to play h4, rook to g7, start opening up white's king. At this point, rook f to b1 was suggested, which is of course very, very natural, but GCash goes for the somewhat surprising f takes g5. After queen to g5, rook f3, all of white's pawns are isolated, but white is still actually totally fine here. He can control the king side with moves like queen to d4, rook to f2, and black's pawn on f5 is also a serious target. From here we got queen g7, rook f2, bishop to d7, and now queen to b4. GCash might have missed a slight chance here with queen to b2, keeping an eye on the e-pawn while also hitting the b-pawn. The point here is that if Fabi backs up with bishop to c8, then in this position, white could take on f5, and this one is actually not looking great for black, as they can't take on e5 without losing the bishop on c8. But if bishop takes f5, then rook takes f5, and this one is actually looking at least somewhat better for white. Instead, we saw queen b4 in the game, but now after bishop to c8, bishop takes f5, the game basically liquidates into a draw. We get the same position as before, but with white's queen on b4. This allows black to take on e5. The players went into a queen endgame, and this one was basically dead drawn, and ended after queen b7, queen g3, queen takes c6, and here Caruana just gives perpetual, as black has no winning chances here whatsoever. If he doesn't give perpetual, then white is ready to move the queen out of the way and start pushing the c-pawn, so a draw was absolutely the right result in this one. Moving on to the game between Vidit and Nepo, this was definitely the most dramatic game of the day. It starts off with Nepo's typical Petrov defense, and Vidit opts for this line with knight to c4 and queen to e2. After queen to e7, we basically get an endgame out of the opening, but one that's still very, very interesting and full of ideas. So bishop g4, around here, Nepo started thinking, forcing the queen trade. Vidit does take, goes rook to b1, and Vidit might have had a small advantage here, nothing special, but quickly actually the game turns into Nepo's favor. Here after c4, rook e8, h4, bishop to f6, Vidit had to go bishop to b2 here to keep equality, but instead he plays the natural move c3. And he likely underestimated Nepo's response here in the move c5, which actually rips white open on this diagonal. Bishop d3 is played, threatening bishop to e4. And now after knight c6, d5, we start to see some complications here, but knight e5, black is all right. Hitting the bishop on d3, Vidit snags this pawn, takes on e6, fe6, and we reach this endgame where objectively black is slightly better here due to white's weaknesses on the queen side. But Vidit manages to generate tons of play in this position and actually plays really, really creative and imaginative chess. He pushes a5 here, sacrificing the pawn to get the rook in. After rook d7, trades, rook to d1. White starts playing against this d-pawn. So knight to g4 now, and bishop f4. Black gives check and goes e5, and this ends up being a very serious strategic concession that gives up a lot of light squares in the center. So bishop e3 now, knight to b6. And at this point, the evaluation of the position is really quite unclear, as black has an extra pawn, and it seems like this a pawn is really strong. But white is actually very, very active here and has ideas of rook h1 and followed by h5. So king e4 is played, a4, rook to a1, rook to b3, king d3. Pawn pushes to a3. Actually, at this moment, Vidit likely missed a big chance here with the move h5, where black can take on c3, but that leads to h takes g6, threatening mates with rook h1, as well as king to f5, and then rook to h7, trapping black's king on g7. For example, rook c4, king f5, rook h4, black would have to play not to get mated. But here after f4, things look very, very dangerous for black's king. And if white's rook is ever able to get into the game, it could just prove absolutely fatal. So possibly one chance missed there by Vidit. Instead in the game, we see that he brings the king to d3, a3, bishop c1, a5, bishop takes a3 is played, and this is another very, very interesting moment. It seems like Nepo had this whole thing planned out, and now he plays this move d5, which at first glance looks very, very scary for white, because if you take with the c-pawn, there's c4 check, opening up the bishop on f8, and black wins the piece and with it the game. And it seems like the same thing would happen in case of knight takes d5. After knight takes d5, cd, black again has c4 check. But it turns out that white is actually winning this endgame. After king takes c4, black can take on a3. White would trade rooks, play king to b5, and now c4 and c5 is coming. Black's king is too far away. Black doesn't have any passed pawns of their own that can run. This a pawn is going to be lost soon. And yeah, engines actually think white is winning in this position. This was move 37. Both players were just down to a couple minutes here, so they likely both overlooked this. But yeah, very, very cool resource. Instead, Vidit goes for king to c2 here, which basically gives up his winning chance. Now black can take on c4, and white's rook doesn't have any obvious ways of getting in. If rook to d1, there's bishop to e7, for example. Of course, this one is hanging as well. So knight e4 played, rook to b5, rook d1, bishop e7. And at this point, they make it to the time control. Vidit repeats once here, but decides to play for the win with knight to g3, likely due to the tournament situation. And this endgame continues to be very, very messy. Objectively, it's close to equal, but it feels like it's Nepo who starts playing for a win in this position. He is up a pawn, and white has certain compensation, but black's king starts to get out. The bishop managed to escape as well. And eventually here, Vidit does go wrong in a very critical moment. We see white snagging this a-pawn on a4, taking on c4, but now e4, things get very sharp. Black's king starts to come in, king to d3, and at this point, knight e5 check was supposedly good for white, although very, very complicated. King to d2, the rook moves to e1 or g1, and yeah, both kings are out in nowhere land. The g6 pawn is hanging, and essentially the position is just super unclear. What we see in the game, though, is bishop to g3. Black takes on c3. White could have taken this one, and this endgame should be a draw after bishop takes b8, king takes c4. But it does feel a little bit uncomfortable for white, as both of his pawns are left on dark squares. Black already has the c-pawn and more active king. So heavy time pressure once again. Vidit goes king to a3, but now rook to b4. And knight b2 check ends up being a losing move here. Once again, knight e5 was the only way to keep the game alive, but then king to d2. Black is better. Once again, it's super messy. Instead, we see knight to b2, but now king to d2, and black is playing c4 next, and white's king is just in huge danger on a3. So after c4, rook to b3 is a pure mate threat. So rook f1 played, but now c4 and white's king here is just getting mated, and white is completely lost. He tried rook f2 check, but now knight e2, the c-pawn starts running, and here the game ended after the moves bishop e5, c3. If takes, then king takes c3, rook takes e2, rook e4 check, wins the rook, and with it the game. Instead, rook f7 was tried by Vidit, but now rook to b7 check, king to a4, and c2. Black has other ways of winning as well. You could also take on b2 here, either with the pawn or with the rook, but c2 is definitely very, very clean, just trying to make a new queen. Knight c4 check, king d3, knight b2 check, king to e4, and here Vidit resigned as he has no good answer to the threats of king takes e5, as well as just queening the pawn. And with this win, Nepo managed to regain his half-point lead over both GCash and Nakamura. Finally, we have the game between Fuja and Abasov. Of course, this one is not super critical for the standings, but nevertheless was a nice win here for Alireza. He once again plays his knight f3 and b3 system, and black was objectively fine out of this opening, but Abasov starts running into difficulties around this moment here. He goes rook to d8, white takes on d5, queen takes d5, bishop f3, now the queen goes to f5. Possibly queen b5 here maybe was more solid for black, where it doesn't block the bishop and covers the b-pawn. After queen f5, rook to c1, it's hard for black to complete his development as the b-pawn is hanging. We see the move knight to e8, but now rook to c5 from Fuja. And at this point, black had to play queen to e6, which is a bit awkward, but this position is still very much playable for black. White has a small edge, but not more than that. Instead, Abasov blunders with this move e5, which would be totally fine hitting the bishop on d4 if not for Fuja's response, the excellent move knight to c4, where of course he's utilizing the pin on the 5th rank and targeting this pawn. f6 is played, defending the pawn, but now rook to d5, forcing a trade of rooks, as other moves for black, for example, bishop to e6, would run into ideas like e4, and black's queen is in big trouble here. The key point being, for example, queen g5, bishop to e3, hitting the queen and the rook on d8, and so black is losing material. So rook takes d5 was played, but now bishop takes and bishop c5, and white is just positionally dominating here with just fantastic development, and it's very, very hard for black to get the rook out. So queen d7 was the try, but now bishop to f3, very simple play from Fuja. If queen takes d1, rook takes d1, this endgame is just lost for black as the rook wants to come into d8, but also if black's bishop moves, then again, the b pawn will fall, the a pawn will fall, and so on. Instead, we saw rook to b8, but now just bishop takes a7, rook e8, and knight to b6. Very nice little finish here from Fuja. After queen takes d1, rook d1, black is forced to take the bishop on a7, but now rook to d8, and white is threatening to win back not just one piece, but the second piece, as rook takes e8 forces bishop to f8, and because he's losing 2 pieces now, white is going to be up a piece in the endgame, and in view of this, Abasov resigned. Moving to the key game in the women's candidates, this was Tanjong's white game against Caruana Logno. This one starts off as a Catalan with an early move, knight bd2, black goes c5, and in this one, black was also quite fine out of the opening, both sides just completing their development here. But after dc, knight c4, queen e7, black maybe should have just traded on d1, because queen e7, knight to g5, white starts to get a bit of an initiative here. And after e5, knight e4, white is already feeling a little bit better in this position. Queen to f3, some pressure on the queen side. Nevertheless, the game was definitely quite complicated. We see takes on c6, e4, winning back the piece. And black was doing quite all right here. Knight e5, king g8, h4, knight back to c4. But soon the game does get very, very sharp. White comes in with queen to c7, b5, knight e5, bishop f6, and now rook to c5. Black might have had a nice chance here with the move f4, ripping open white's king side. If e takes f4, then e3 would be the idea. And then if takes, then the queen comes into h3, for example, and this is super, super dangerous for white. G3 and h1 is hanging. Okay, g2 obviously is a mate threat as well. So this was definitely a chance for black. She goes rook e8 instead, rook takes b5, and now bishop takes b3, which ends up being a losing mistake. Once again, f4 was the only chance for black to stay in the game, just generating lots of counterplay on the king side. After bishop takes b3, we get rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, hitting the queen, but white now takes on a7. Black has to move the bishop out of the way, but now knight to c6, and white's pieces here are just way too active. The threat, of course, is queen takes g7 mate, and here black's king side is essentially falling apart. Bishop f6 was played, but now white trades, and queen to d7, all of white's pieces get into the action here. Rook takes f5, everything was hanging for black, the rook, the bishop, and the f-pawn, so no way to hold on to everything. So rook takes f5, king h2, black's king side here just starts to get decimated, g4, bishop to g6, h5, very nice move, bishop takes rook, queen takes rook with check, king to h7, and now not GF, which would allow queen takes F2, where it appears that black has a perpetual, but just simple move king to G3, covering the F pawn, and black again can't defend the king side. So bishop E6, the knight comes in, queen E5 now, just some nice centralization, knight to E6, and here the final finish just leads to black's king getting mated, G5, threatening G6, takes, king H6, king to H4, and this was the end of the game with black having no good defense to the threat of queen H8 mate. And with this win, Tanjong once again was able to regain half-point lead over her main rival, Lei Tingjie, heading into the final 3 rounds of the event. So that takes us into tomorrow's round 12, where we're going to see the following pairings: Naka white against Fuja, Abasov white against GCash, Caruana white against Vidit, and Nepo white against Pragnananda. So it's going to be a very, very dramatic final 3 rounds to this candidates. Hopefully you folks continue to tune in to these recaps, and until next time, take care.